Well, good morning and welcome to my studio. So this exercise is a small exercise I decided to do for my watercolour class, and I thought to paint a flag in motion or even a flag statically laid out might be a good one, because there's all kinds of different colours and drawing potential here, and you have to be neat. But I thought, could I do it as a loose watercolour? And so I began with this particular iteration, and I found a photograph of a flag blowing in the wind with some light on it and thought this would be quite a good subject. So I sketched it out fairly freely and had a go at painting it fairly loosely, and in many ways I've achieved what I wanted to achieve, but I've always been quite particular, and I began to get very wound up by the stars not being perfect, and even though it's quite a small painting and I suppose that's quite forgivable, I kept looking at the stars and thinking they're just not right and I can't live with this. And so you can see there's lots of areas where these two, for example, should have been darkened down, and the drawing of them, the star doesn't follow the form of the flag, and I began to get too critical, and so I thought, well, I'll have another go. So this is the second iteration of it. I chose a slightly different photograph, similar in essence, but with a more moody sky, and the light was more dramatic, and perhaps there were a few less stars actually visible, and I thought, well, that's good for a class, because getting too bogged down with stars could be quite problematic, and maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. But I thought, well, no, I'll persist. I spent longer drawing the stars. I still wanted it to be free. I think I'd learned a few things from the first job, and once I'd painted this, I was reasonably happy with it as a beginning for a class demonstration, but as you'll see, I couldn't live with that one either. So I reached for the trusty sketchbook and took a bit more time drawing it out, and decided I would lay off the background a bit, keep it very light, and begin by drawing the stars a bit more carefully and trying to understand the folds and shapes a bit more carefully. Now, this is in a sketchbook. I wasn't intending it to be a finished thing, and it isn't by any means, but it did teach me quite a lot. And I thought, well, if I go in reasonably tight, and then I can go back to it and maybe loosen it, soften some edges, add a bit of spilling over wash and bleed, it might make it look a bit more loose, and free it up a bit so that you still focus on those stars perhaps, and then you can appreciate the watercolour technique as well. So that was the basis for the final iteration of this work, which is what you'll see in the time lapse, which is about to follow. So here's just a summary of those three versions. You can see they're not very large. They're both done on 300 gram watercolour paper. The sketchbook's a Hahnemann watercolour pad, and they're just lightly drawn out in pencil first, and the watercolours are Winsor & Newton. So here goes the final version, which I've drawn out pretty carefully this time on another piece of paper and then transferred by tracing it from that paper. And I'm going in pretty carefully around those stars and working on the darks first. I just thought in this case it needed to go from fairly dark, and then the light blues are where the light of the lighter parts of the blue area are, and I've got a couple of hard edges there, but they'll soften as I go along. I was really interested in getting those star shapes turning around the shape of that curve. So here's the whole area on its first pass. There are still some lines which perhaps could be softened off there. I'm going in very lightly with the reds. You see I've cleaned my palette there on the right, and I'm just using reds and pinks, different warm and cool reds. At the moment they're fairly cool reds, and the light itself is coming from the left hand side of the image, and as I go I'm getting darker and darker into the shade, so you can see that the form is building up as I go in layers. So just taking my time to begin getting a first layer in and start to describe the shapes and the form, looking at the reference, looking at the light all the time. So in there, a little behind warmer reds, because the light is coming through the flag, and that seemed to create a slightly warmer red on the back side. This ragged edge really of the flag that's worn away in the wind in a storm, I quite liked that and wanted to generalize it, keep it fairly loose, but make it very recognizable as to what it was. So my intention with this particular version was to paint it reasonably tightly. The paper itself is a knot surface, so it's not very smooth. It has some texture to it, but it's not fully rough either. It's a nice halfway, which is nice for watercolour techniques. It doesn't always lend itself to really tight things, but I seem to be managing okay. I'm just using a very cheap synthetic round brush with a superb point on it. I don't know, I managed to get these brushes pretty cheap. You can't get them anymore, certainly not that cheap. I've not seen them since, and I bought several packs of them and they've been superb. I've even used them for oil paintings, but sadly they're not branded, and I bought as many as I could, but you can't get them now. But they seem to last forever, certainly on watercolours, and the points are fantastic. So you can see that the whites of the flag, the white stripes, are not that white. And if you painted them white, well, you can't with watercolour really, you're just using the white of the paper, which is a great illustration as to how varied white can actually appear in terms of warm and cool and tonality. In order to represent white, white in the shade is not like white that is full white. So here it is, a tight version. I quite like it as it is, but I couldn't leave it like that, because if you remember, the idea was to go loose. So sadly the camera turned itself off and I missed adding the background, which is so annoying. However, apologies for that, we'll carry on. I'm doing looser techniques now around it, which obviously alter the nature of the whole painting, and it goes back to my initial intention. So a relatively tight version of the flag is now being loosened by adding washes and splashes and various other things. I softened some edges, I wiped some areas out, added a couple of runs, just employed various loose techniques over the top. And I think that has kind of worked. So I started off tight and I've loosened it as I've gone, which is a bit contra to the thought of a loose watercolour as such, but if you enjoy fairly detailed tight painting, which I always have, sometimes being loose can be a bit tricky. You tend to need to want that structure at the beginning, and that's what I have worked around on this particular occasion. So I hope you enjoyed the video. It's been a long time since I've made one, and time has been very elusive lately to sit down and make videos. So hopefully I'll get a chance to make a few more as the year wears on now, and be able to concentrate a bit more on painting. And please like and subscribe, and hopefully see you on the next.